Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophy Podcast. My name is Thomas Jared Farmer, joined by my co-hosts. Let me do that shit again. All right. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophy Podcast. My name is Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Raymond Perrier.
Hey, I went first this time. Sweet. Suck it, Mike.
And Michael Granado.
What's Gucci?
I'm out of practice with this because we haven't been doing these frequently because me and Mike are in the process of moving to various locations.
Shoot me now.
And COVID-19 and end of semesters and all of that stuff.
Trying to find new jobs since education's basically gone to a halt.
All sorts of fun stuff. Yeah, stuff like that. So we talked the last time about humanism. So today's topic, we want to talk a little bit about transhumanism, what that entails, and some of the implications involved in it. So I'm going to kick it over to Ray. What's your thoughts on transhumanism, Ray?
Well, I just want to start and say that I'm proud that we once and for all decided what humanism is in the last episode.
We did.
Debates are over. Sign us up for the Nobel Peace Prize. No. Transhumanism, I wanted to talk about this because, and humanism, I just happened to be doing a research paper on, and it was ideas were floating around in my brain, and I wanted to hash them out. But transhumanism, the idea of touching on it again, because we've touched on it in the past a little bit, was really just about this new TV series on Amazon called Upload that I found fascinating and slightly interesting. No, more than interesting. It's a good show. Forced each of you to watch at least an episode to get a sense of it.
I didn't watch any of it.
You haven't watched any of it? Okay, so Michael's going to be our...
I don't trust your taste in TV shows.
Yes, I do have the least tasteful interest in TV of all three of us, bro. But it's
basic, right?
As far as heady academic stuff goes, I don't want subtitles, and I don't want it to be black and white. I want it to be candy for my brain.
He's so basic.
That's why I'm not watching this show.
So if you haven't watched it, just the brief idea behind it is that technology has gotten to a point where we have figured out how to upload a human consciousness into a virtual reality. But the story is about, the sort of setting is about the way in which that technology is being used, the context and in which it is sort of located, which is still fundamentally familiar to us, which makes it interesting. So one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because transhumanism, as popular and as noble as a lot of people think it is, sort of misses this aspect of how, it might inevitably get implemented, and that's under the sort of capitalist regime of economies and what comes with that. But let's start first with what is transhumanism, and the only way to really understand that is to understand it with reference to humanism. And humanism, as we noted in the previous episode, is about studies, is about human nature and what it means to be human. And the transhumanists tend to focus on our physical manifestations, our physical limitations, they would say. And then the sort of futuristic world in which we can transcend, hence the word transhumanism, the prefix, transcend our material and bodily forms by uploading ourselves into, ironically, another material bodily form, aka a computer, which is usually the subject of our ridicule for them, right, Jared? Our great dislike of transhumanism because they fail to realize that computers are not infinite either.
Yeah, no, and limited in distinct ways, and then also like part of my critique of all of this that I'm going to keep returning to is that part of what it means to be human is to be embodied in a particular way, and so they see this as a goal, like that humanity is essentially an imperfect form, and that in transcending, they're not simply wishing to preserve human life, but to escape humanity, that humanity itself is some sort of prison. Um, Now, some of this goes back to, statements that you can see with someone like Nietzsche, right? That humanity is not in its final form. Like, we're a stage in the evolutionary process, and I think most people are willing to accept that. But there's something about transhumanism that I think misses some inherent dignity about being embodied in a particular way, that I think is rather distasteful, just from my own perspective.
So I want to make some quick qualifications here. Um, I'm more than happy to talk about like downloading the brain into the computer thing, because I do have a lot of thoughts on that. And I think we're somewhat in agreement on that idea. But I also don't want to reduce transhumanism just to that, because I think transhumanism as an idea and as a concept is bigger. So I want to come back to kind of expanding that. Unless you want to talk about the brain thing first, then we could talk about that.
We should expand on it because I think the problem that I have with a lot of transhumanism discussions has to do with the conversation around whether or not humans can upload into a computer. Um, and that's not the only way or even the most imaginative way in which we can talk about transhumanism and the sort of transformation of transcendence we could accomplish um, using technology and thing. I mean, we could, talk about cyborgs, excuse me, integrating technology into our own, bodies and mastering, different biological forces within the human being, genome editing, all of these things, hyper sophisticated, medicine that releases us from a lot of the limitations set on human beings by diseases and afflictions and illnesses and stuff like that. A very simple, like for example, very simple. I think a very simple form of transhumanism, or at least sort of a vision of it, is when an amputee gets a prosthetic and is able to gain some amount of function back of their prior existence or something like that, right? That would be a form in its own right of a sort of transhumanism, so to speak.
Well, I think a better example, yeah. I think, well, just one thing to that. I think that it's one thing if you're wanting to restore functionality. It's another thing if modification attempts to go beyond that. So you're seeing with a lot of contemporary experimentation with prostheses that people are not simply wanting to restore functionality, but are wanting to somehow increase functionality. And I think that would be closer in line with something like transhumanism, because you're not simply saying like we're going to restore original function to an amputee or someone who was born differently abled, but instead we're going to try to see what are the limitations and go beyond those.
And I think it's that attitude, as far as my understanding of transhumanism, it's that attitude that defines it. This idea and belief that through science, mainly through technology, that we'll be one day able to transcend whatever it is we're talking about, whether it's our mental capacity, whether it's our physical abilities. It's this sort of positive attitude and belief that we will be able to do this. And I think it's also the moral claim that we should do this. And this is something that we ought to pursue as a species.
And that's the question that I think that becomes interesting is not whether or not we can, is whether or not we ought to, right? That sort of moral question.
I think can is also a problematic when it comes to something like downloading consciousness, right? Because it hasn't been sufficiently demonstrated that it's within capacity to do that. So, I mean, I know we said we don't want to make this the only point, but it is a point that needs to be made that we're not nearly as close to being able to download consciousness as some people seem to think. There is mental processes are still largely a black box. We know a lot more than we ever did, but that doesn't mean that we are anywhere close to what you see in a lot of popular science fiction. And the things that we do know about the brain in terms of like brain mapping and whatnot, we don't know. We know how certain functions contribute to certain behaviors, but we don't know why they do that. So there's a big gaping hole in our knowledge with respect to this. Now, I'm not someone that thinks that there are some things that I just don't think technology will ever. There's some points that I don't think technology will ever get to. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois, the program in philosophy there at the time I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know what it's like these days. But at the time it was an analytic program, and we spent a considerable amount of time focusing on philosophy of mind, philosophy of technology, philosophy of science. And so there was a lot of thought experiments really to get you thinking about, what exactly is the mind, things like brains and bats and whatnot. But there's also experiments like, so if you could bifurcate the brain, right? So if you were able to cut the brain in half and then implant the two halves into two different bodies. When they get up from the table, like, is it the same person? Is it a different person? Yada, yada, yada. I mean, that's an interesting thought experiment to ask, well, what does that do to personal identity and, sense of self and all of that stuff? But a big missing aspect is, like, can we do that? It's like asking about, like, full head transplants. Yeah. I mean, theoretically, there's no reason why we couldn't do that. But practically, is it possible? Same thing with like time travel. I think theoretically, I'm not a physicist, but as far as I understand it, which is very limited, I don't think that it's theoretically impossible. But is it practically? Seems practically impossible.
I would say it's theoretically impossible too, but that's only because I've been reading a lot about the philosophy of time. But so I want to talk about this downloading your brain to a computer bit, but I also want to come back to the talking about transhumanism in general because I have a lot of thoughts on this. Um, First and foremost, I think that it's a false analogy, uh, comparing the brain to a computer. Comparing the brain to a computer, I think, is a false analogy. And I'll give you an example of why I think that's the case. Because I've been reading a lot as far as my thesis goes. I've been reading a lot about memory and sort of the role that memory plays in constructing like meaningful personal narratives. So memory is also one of these areas that transhumanists draw similarity between the human brain and the computer. Uh, when in fact, memory, as far as a computer is concerned, works nothing like how it works in the brain. So I'm typing on a Word document, I save that Word document, I label it, I put it in a file that says typed Word documents. I don't know. I come back 2 weeks later, I can retrieve that file instantly, and it's the exact same where I left it, right? So it's the exact same words, how I phrased it, how I misspelled it, all my grammatical errors, all of that's preserved to the T. I come back 2 years later, same thing, right? That is nowhere near how memory retrieval in the brain works. Memory, as far as the brain is concerned, is super messy. It's a very messy process. Not only not only is it simply not a matter of retrieval, but the information that is stored in our brain doesn't remain the same. It's molded and manipulated not just by our current situations, but also by other past memories. It's not, I think a brain, I think of a computer as a really bad analogy in that sense. It's memory in the brain is like a constantly changing and morphing structure, not and it doesn't just take place in one part of the brain, it takes place in all these different parts of the brain. As I'm sure everyone who listens to this knows, memories are incredibly uncertain and unstable. Memories change over time. New memories of past events can be created that never happened. There's countless numbers of examples in psychology that we can get into. It's not just a matter of straight information retrieval. It's a much more complicated process. And one more thing, I also think this analogy doesn't take into account basic biological features of human existence. Like we talked about this issue of embodiedness that Jared brought up. That is, you can't separate the functioning of the brain from the body. And what I mean by that is the brain is an organ that has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And so there's processes in the brain that are really, really old, for example. And we have to remember the primary purpose of a computer may be to figure out a particular problem that's set before it. The primary purpose of the brain is, first and foremost, to keep us alive, maybe to force us to reproduce in some way, shape, or form, right? So there are super strong innate biological factors that form and mold our thinking that there's just simply no parallel with a computer there.
Well, to your point about false memories, have I mentioned in any of our conversations about the Lost in the Mall experiment?
No.
Are either of you familiar with it? I mean,
No.
Okay, so there was, I believe it was first presented by the psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. I read about this years ago. So if I get some of the details wrong, one, it'll be an example.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was about to say the proof is in the pudding, right?
Yeah, one, it'll be an example, but also I would encourage you to go and look at it for yourself, just in case I make a mistake anywhere. So I read this as a book chapter years ago. So the thought experiment took place within the context of debates about repressed memories and false memories. And they wanted to test the possibility of implanting purely false memories into people. So Loftus and I think one of her students, I don't remember exactly how many people were involved, they on break had students go back, a student or a group of students go back to their family and get some of their family members involved in this experiment. And what they were going to try to do is dupe another unsuspecting family member. Now, if you've seen the movie Inception, then you know that if you're going to implant, now this was actually years before Inception, but the principle still obtains. If you're going to implant an idea in someone's head, it has to be a simple idea, and it has to be the sort of idea that can kind of grow and develop within that context. So if you're going to implant a memory, it can't be something that the person could not otherwise see themselves as having been involved in. So probably not going to successfully convince someone that they were abducted by aliens unless it's Michael. Anyway, so what they landed on was a plausible scenario that did not happen. So what they were going to try to convince one of their family members of was that they, when they were a child, had been lost in the mall. Now, if you've never had that experience, then you could at least imagine having had that experience, and it's the sort of thing that could have happened to you and you have forgotten. So what they did is they kind of brought it up in conversation, like, hey, John, do you remember that time when you were lost in the mall as a kid? And the subject said, no, I don't remember that. But then they start adding details, and then other people pile into the conversation. Oh, yeah, I remember that, yada, yada, yada. And then you have secondary confirmation. Now, what's interesting is, again, I don't know if I'm fabricating some of this, but as I recall it now, there were individuals who were not convinced, right? that this didn't happen. You must be talking about someone else. There were other people who admitted that perhaps it had happened, but they don't remember it. But most interestingly, at least some subjects not only admitted that it happened, but they started adding details themselves, right? So they successfully implanted a false memory in a subject, and the subject, once they had the basic idea, they provided the details, right? And then they were hesitant once the ruse was up, right? Once they told the person that this was false, it was difficult for the person to let go of it because now they had banked it as an actual memory. And so, in the context of the debate about the fluidity of memory, this is problematic because I think that it has been demonstrated that repressed memories are a thing. Like especially individuals who've experienced personal trauma. So, as a defense mechanism, the brain can simply cordon off memories, and then it may be years later before someone remembers something. At the same time, there's been plenty of experiments which have demonstrated that you can implant false memories. This is especially true with children. So, if you have so, for example, because they know this, responsible detectives and whatnot now have to account for it. You can't ask leading questions of small children in the context of something like investigating abuse, right? So if you ask leading questions like, did so-and-so touch you there, right? Well, that's a leading question, and then it can lead to a false memory where they fabricate a memory. So you have to be very vague and get details so that you don't inadvertently falsely accuse someone of doing something heinous. So memory is porous, it's fluid, it's full of problems. It's also the reason why classically, you have to separate eyewitnesses to get different testimonies because individuals' testimonies start to blend together, right? Someone provides additional detail, and then that becomes part of your memory.
I also think it's telling that most people, and this is not like a solid argument by any stretch of the imagination, but that most people who make or utilize this argument typically fall into like the computer science category. Like neuroscientists and biologists rarely utilize that analogy that the brain is like a computer. Most of the time, it's people on the other end, people on the more technological end, that are making these claims.
Yeah, so in terms of how this impacts the transhumanism, I think that gets into the idea that we can essentially escape. We talked about physical limitations, but memory points to not just physical, but this is a part of the problem I think with transhumanism is that it separates the physical and the mental, which is what essentially we're critiquing on some level, is that you as an embodied individual as an embodied individual, it really doesn't make sense beyond this, beyond the scope of just trying to speak, clearly that there's a difference between mind and body. Um, and that's something that, in the history of philosophy, we dealt with time and time again, for the most part, put behind us and have come up with new ways of speaking about it. Uh, Hylomorphism in the medieval time, and then it resurged in dialectics in a postmodern time, and then now just the recognition that the mind is body and the body is mind, just sort of the acceptance that there's no real distinction to be made there. And that I think that's really where I think the ought we to do certain things becomes problematic, because if we just take the example we started with, which is upload, within the first few minutes of the first episode, this is a spoiler alert, so if you are going to watch that show, here it is.
No one's going to watch that show, right?
Nobody's going to watch that show, right? So to get the guy to upload this guy, the main character, into this computer, this virtual reality, which is highly a capitalist system, you have to pay, even in the afterlife. Your progeny, your children, or the people you left behind are paying like a subscription service for you to exist in the way that you exist. And every time you eat like a donut, or you drink a glass of water, or you drink a glass of wine, despite the fact that it's just coding and it doesn't actually cost them anything, they charge you for it. It's like in-app purchases. It's crazy. But even to get to this virtual reality, they put you in this machine that effectively vaporizes your head and just leaves your body behind on a bed of ice. And that is, for me, that's a striking moment. First of all, there's no going back, right? Which is maybe the point of some of this. But to the other point, how many people's heads were severed before they got it right? Like, that's always the issue with these technological advancements. Like, how much are we willing to sacrifice the health and well-being of human individuals for the sake of these lofty goals for humanity, right? I mean, we do it all the time. Like, did we need to go to the moon? Do we need to do a lot of these things that we do when we could be turning, like the Mars shot? Like, do we need to go to Mars? I mean, I'm the first person to say I would love it if we were colonizing Mars, but I also think, like, when you have the just
Colonizing is an icky word, Raymond.
well, it's not colonizing if nobody lives there, right? I think we can fairly say that Earth owns Mars at this point because nobody's there to claim Mars for them. No, I'm just kidding. The point is that why should we be spending so much time doing these things just for the sake of our curiosity or the possibility of some grand technology that could impact humanity when we have everything we need right here to do things like stop world hunger, stop inequality, create a better world that in a society that focuses on, delving out injustices across the races, across religious grounds, across, whatever. We just don't we use the STEM fields, I think, in many cases as a way of escaping. And we want them to solve problems that in many cases they were the reasons these problems were created. Like global warming is a phenomenon of STEM getting ahead of itself. It's a phenomenon of technology coupled with capitalism and all of these other global, perspectives on the world. But really, it's the only reason we could even think about over polluting the planet is because we've been pursuing technology without really considering whether or not we should, whether or not we ought to in certain regards.
I don't remember. Well, I was going to say one thing. I don't remember who said this, and this is going to be an approximation of the quote anyway. But I heard one time someone say something to the effect of, technology always outpaces our moral capacities to wield it. Mike?
Well, there's a few things I wanted to touch on, but I think what you're talking about, Raymond, gets back to kind of the ethos or like the ethical claim of transhumanism that I kind of wanted to address at the beginning. We could talk about it now. So I think and I do want to say some things about space exploration and stuff like that because I think we might disagree there. But um, I think if we can kind of like try to define the central or one of the most important transhumanist claims or kind of what they believe, it's certainly a positive attitude towards technology, but I think where the transhumanist would depart from you there is by saying that, again, getting back to the ought, that this is something that we ought to be pursuing. That any sort of technological progress that allows us to transcend our natural human capabilities, or in this case, that would allow us to survive outside of the destruction of the earth for whatever reason, that it should be pursued at all cost, perhaps over and against other moral pursuits. Do you agree with that, or?
Well, let's see. I don't disagree with that in principle. I just think that what the problem is that we'll take it in two steps. So first of all, just because we're immediately thinking of this, the problem with that I think is that there's an inherent inconsistency. That what I'm trying to say is that the pursuit itself, however moral and noble, is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy.
What do you mean?
The pursuit of, say all of the technologies that would get us to something like Mars are also the pursuit of all of the features and systematic necessities to create these technologies and to mass produce them and to, prepare us for this move are the same ones that are going to end up killing the planet anyways. Don't you think?
See,
I mean, on some level.
I don't think that there's anything noble about the goal at all. I don't think there's anything noble about the goal of eternal self perpetuation in the first place.
Well, yeah, right. It's this deeply narcissistic goal.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't. I'm certainly so. Make a couple distinctions again here. I don't think that I would consider myself to be a transhumanist per se, but I do think that transhumanism raises some very important questions that we should talk about sooner rather than later. Like the getting back to the quote that you were saying, Jared, about how ethics always falls behind technology. We've made that mistake before with, I don't know, take your pick, atomic weapons, for example.
I would say, yeah, basically all technology.
Yeah, or even like something like social media. I mean, look at the this is completely off topic, but look at the psychological impact of social media on children and teenagers. I mean, we've already made the mistakes before. So I think in that sense, I would agree with transhumanism. I don't know if this is an agree with, but I think we should be having these conversations now. And even if downloading your brain to a computer is silly, I still think it's something that needs to be talked about before it's too late, so to speak.
Well, in the context of, like I said, discussions about philosophy of mind, philosophy of technology, philosophy of science, like those are interesting questions to ask about the nature of personhood and self-identity, regardless of whether or not they become technological realities. So it forces you, when you talk about brain implantation, it forces you to ask questions, essentializing questions about what it means to be human. And those questions are useful regardless of whether or not it ever becomes a practical possibility. But I think some of the issues raised by this show, which is kind of a silly show, but it does one of the things which separates it from, say, something like more, not necessarily highbrow, but something certainly more less silly. That's the only way I can think of it. Something like The Matrix or Inception deal with similar questions, but they're also like 20 years old now, and so the reality that you see now in a context like this show is the nightmarish hellscape of a capitalist afterlife, right? I mean, it's utterly horrifying, even the prospect. Um,
Because to fill in the gap, because I don't know how far you got into it, Jared, but for both of you, when you don't have money and you get uploaded, you're basically on like a payment plan. And when you, I forget what they call it, but it's basically the people at the bottom of the deck, right, in the like in the basement of this virtual reality, who get like 2 gigs a month of data, which means they basically can't do anything. They're living in a perpetual state of inequality, and just there's no, why it brings up the question, why would you even want to live this way? Like at the final scene of the season is him being basically demoted to this reality because of his decisions he's made, and running out of data simply because he made a phone call to the outside world that was so emotional that the data couldn't process it, and then he was just frozen, like stuck there until the next month. So that's like the weird thing of it. But even besides that, I'm not against transhumanism generally speaking. I just don't think that it has the substance, the ethical or moral substance, or even the vision really to be its own pursuit, because it's always interwrapped with all these other social features, like in the case of upload being interwrapped with capitalism, which means, yeah, we've got the transhumanist dream, but we're still living the same shitty lives that you would have lived even if you were living in reality. So what's the point? Like extending the same life. Like there's no real escape there. You escape the death, but you haven't solved the social, the cultural, the ethical, and the moral issues. So I think that transhumanism should be the means to an end outside of itself, which is the greater part of helping and saving humanity and the individuals of humanity. And they may say that that's what their goal is, but it seems like oftentimes technology gets wrapped up in all of these other aspects of human life, and they end up becoming greedy and selfish and exclusive and limiting and hurtful towards other people. The first instance of AI is almost certainly going to be used to kill people. I mean, let's be honest. It's going to
Well,
be
but then it
militarized.
means
It's a military
yeah,
game.
Yeah, it'll be militarized instantly.
Yeah, instant.
Technology is almost always militarized. I think that personally, I don't see any value in this. Not really in the philosophy of it, because I think that transhumanism is an interesting prefix. I think you could just as well describe it as anti-humanism, though. It sees humanity as being a diminished form. It's a stage on the way to some sort of final goal in evolution. And if you think of the world and human beings in that way, then you rob them of inherent dignity. And in doing so, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to get to whatever your end goal is? People are expendable because they don't have inherent value, because all they are stages on the way to some other journey. And as long as you see the world in that frame, then again, whatever is necessary in order to get to that final goal is justifiable, right? So fuck off poor people. Those people are just part of, the process. And this is the reason why, personally, if you want to see who's trending with respect to transhumanism, it's people in tech, and it's the extremely affluent, right? Your Elon Musks of the world, the people who are all hot for rocketry at the moment now are venture capitalists and Silicon Valley types. And the reason why is because they see themselves typically as being at the top of some sort of hierarchy. They deserve to be there, and they want to perpetuate that forever. And the unwashed masses are just expendable. And this is the thing that I say to people all the time, which is, do you really think that Elon Musk is building this infrastructure so that you can go to space? No. They are looking for a plan B for when capitalism inevitably destroys the planet. They want to continue their existence. They're looking to build bunkers and to get off world, right? And there's something, I think, deeply nefarious about this, because all of this is kind of a narcissist version of heaven, right? What if we could have perpetual life without all of the ickiness of lived experience? Well, that's not life as far as I'm concerned. It's just not. And I think that what's really important in all of this is, if you accept the inherent dignity of being a person, then that comes with the limitations, right? I think that there's some value in the finality of life. It makes you appreciate things. And the vapid desire to extend, and perpetuate your existence at the cost of everything else, I think is just, I don't see any value to it whatsoever, personally. All right, fellas, time has come for final thoughts. So, Raymond, final thoughts.
Yeah, I started the conversation, so I'll be the first to talk about the end of it. So I think that transhumanism has a role to play, honestly, in our society. I think that the development of technology is important because I think it serves humanity to better itself, to help other individuals. I think that those kinds of ideas need to be understood in the context, and that the pursuit of technology in and of itself is not enough to solve human issues, like sincere and like authentic ones, and that you have to understand what our end goal is before we understand, the means that are going to get there. And that's a weird way of sort of turning the ethical conundrum on its head, but we have to have both of those too. I mean, if you're just creating technology willy-nilly, then you don't know how people are going to co-opt that and limit its use to people, or we spend all this intellectual property and all this intellectual mental capacity on creating selfie sticks when we could be doing much better things for our society. You know what I mean? Content for the sake of content on social media is not very beneficial to the development of a more equal, egalitarian, society that staves off hunger and illness and suffering and gives people hope and the ability to pursue freedom in their own interest. You know what I mean? So that's my final thoughts, essentially.
Yeah. So I would. I've been thinking about how to put this. I don't know. Maybe we can come back later at some other point to talk about some of these concepts. So, on the one hand, I think I've brought this up before, but I mean, a central problem that I have with transhumanism would just be to echo the words of the French philosopher, anthropologist Jacques Ellul in his Technological Society. I don't think that technological progress at any and all cost is a necessarily good thing. I don't think it's a good thing. And I don't believe that technological progress is inherently good. I think that there are plenty of instances in which it can lead to highly negative things, highly problematic things. On the other hand, I do believe that this attitude that I think what transhumanism does have going for it is that this attitude that the human condition can be improved, expanded upon, that we can overcome our natural elements, that we can overcome nature itself. I mean, part of that lies at the heart of science itself. I mean, if you look at like the origins of medical science, what were they trying to do? They were trying to cure things like death. They realized that wasn't really possible, but that's like kind of what the impetus was. And so, on the other hand, I think that they have tapped into something that is kind of basic in the scientific attitude and mindset. And I do wholeheartedly support things like space exploration. Although I do think that there are some ethical problems and consideration that, and I'm open to having conversations about like, should we really be pursuing this while all this other stuff's happening? But I do think that these things in and of themselves might not seem worthy of pursuit, but if you look at the history, for example, of space exploration, it's produced countless number of things that help us in our day-to-day life. So in that sense, I do think it's a worthy pursuit, but we could talk about this later if you want to.
Well, in summation, let me say a quote. The most famous line from a poem by Robert Browning was that man's reach should always exceed his grasp, for if not, what is a heaven for? And that's a good quote. And I agree with it. And I agree with everything that Mike said. At the same time, right? And because, first off, that is a human goal, right? Part of what it means to be human is to reach, right? To search, to be curious, and I value that highly. At the same time, I would caution by saying that I feel that part of the downside of what we call transhumanism now is that it takes human beings as only having an instrumental and not an inherent value. It treats human beings as we are presently constituted as imperfect. And there's a very Gnostic sense in which a lot of transhumanists treat the body as something to escape instead of something to value and appreciate. And it's just difficult for me to think that if you see the body as something fundamentally something that should be escaped, that you will treat people with dignity. Like I cannot see how you can hold those two things together. At the same, in the same sense, I think that there's something valuable about human limitations. And we have to hold those two things as best we can in concert, right? So one last quote, this one from a song. Do you guys know Jason Isbell at all? So one of my favorite songs, he has a song called If We Were Vampires, and there's a line from the song that goes, if we were vampires, we'd go out on the sidewalk and smoke and laugh at all the lovers and their plans, and I wouldn't feel the need to hold your hand. Maybe time running out is a gift. I'll work hard till the end of my shift. I think that there's something valuable in our limitations because they make us appreciate time. There's something valuable in our limitations because they make us appreciate others. And if we're constantly only concerned with trying to extend our existence and escape ourselves, then we won't appreciate the world around us. So that's all I have on that.
That
Yeah.
wraps it up for us. Um, Thanks for entertaining my desire to talk about this, guys, and Jared for watching that episode of Upload. Mike, I still think you should at least check it out. But
I'll never watch it. No. I'll check it out, Raymond, just for you. Just for you.
Yeah, that's part of my limited time on this planet that I won't get back. But
Is it that bad? Jesus.
yeah, next time join us. We're going to talk about white ignorance and white privilege. So look forward to that.
all right, peace, fellas.
See y'all later.
Bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/fpphilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.